The concrete walls of the federal penitentiary had a way of swallowing sound, as if the building itself wanted to remind the men inside that nothing they said really mattered anymore. For Marcus Devlin, inmate number 44719-06, those walls had been his reality for nearly a decade. Convicted on federal weapons charges and a string of armed robberies across 3 states, he had entered prison at 32 years old with the kind of bravado that only men facing a lifetime behind bars cling to. Now, at 41, the bravado was gone. His body had grown thicker, his hair thinner, and the lines on his face told a story of sleepless nights, endless routines, and the grinding weight of time. But Marcus still had one tether to the world beyond those gates: his wife, Danielle. She was the only one who showed up to see him month after month, the only one who answered his collect calls, who sent him letters written in looping script that smelled faintly of cheap perfume. For Marcus, those visits meant everything. In the yard, he bragged that he still had someone on the outside who loved him, someone who hadn't given up. It kept him going when the days blurred together and the fights in the cell block reminded him that even survival was a full-time job. That's why the morning of visitation always felt different. Guards marched him and a dozen other inmates through the sterile corridors toward the visitation room. Their shackles clinked like wind chimes, echoing off the concrete. Marcus kept his eyes forward, but inside he was buzzing. He'd shaved, smoothed his orange jumpsuit as best he could, even splashed water on his face to look halfway presentable. For just a few hours, he could sit across from Danielle, hold her hands, pretend, if only in the shallowest way, that he was still a husband, not just a number. The visitation room looked almost cheerful compared to the rest of the prison. Rows of metal tables bolted to the ground, plastic chairs, vending machines humming in the corner. But the cheer was a lie. Cameras were everywhere, black bubbles in the ceiling tracking every move. Armed officers stood along the walls, eyes sharp. Even the vending machine snacks were overpriced and stale, but to the men inside, they were luxuries worth savoring if someone cared enough to bring quarters. Marcus scanned the room the moment he stepped in. He spotted Danielle already seated at their usual spot, table number 6 by the window. She was wearing the same long wig she always wore, dark and sleek, her dress conservative but neat. A pair of large sunglasses rested on the table, even though the window let in only a sliver of pale sunlight. She waved when she saw him, and Marcus felt that familiar surge of relief. She had come. She always came. They sat across from one another, the cheap plastic chairs squeaking as they adjusted. Prison rules allowed a brief kiss at the start and end of visitation, but Marcus didn't push it. He leaned in, pressed his lips quickly to hers, then settled back. The touch was quick, almost clinical, but it still sent a jolt through him. In here, intimacy was rationed like water in a desert. "You look good, baby," Danielle said, her voice soft. Marcus noticed her hands trembled slightly when she pushed her sunglasses aside. He chalked it up to nerves. The room was always tense, always buzzing with the quiet hum of desperation. "I'm trying," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "Got a haircut last week. Had to give up half my commissary to get it done, but you're worth it." Danielle laughed, a sound Marcus clung to like gospel. Around them, other inmates talked in low voices with their loved ones. Children fidgeted in laps, wives whispered, mothers wiped tears. For a moment, it was almost normal. Almost. Still, there were cracks in the picture. Marcus had lived with suspicion most of his life, and sometimes he caught himself wondering about Danielle. The way she always avoided talking about her past. The way she'd bristle if he asked about her family, or why no one ever came with her. But then she'd squeeze his hands, tell him she loved him, and the doubts would dissolve. In prison, faith was all a man had. Today, though, Marcus couldn't shake a strange edge to her demeanor. Her smile seemed too tight, her eyes too restless. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on the warmth of her presence, on the way she always showed up when nobody else did. This was his world now. Gray walls, iron bars, and the fragile lifeline of a woman waiting for him across a plastic table. The guards kept watch, their expressions unreadable. Somewhere above, the cameras recorded every blink, every sigh. Marcus knew he was being watched, but for these fleeting hours, it didn't matter. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, telling Danielle about the petty dramas of prison life, about the fights in the rec yard, about the new guard everyone hated. She listened intently, nodding, her hands folded neatly on the table. He told himself that when he got out, whenever that day might come, he and Danielle would start over. A house in the country, maybe away from all this. He had no real plan, but the fantasy was enough to keep him sane. Because in this place, where hope was contraband and time was the cruelest warden of all, love, even the fragile, flickering kind, was the only thing that made a man feel human. And Marcus, for all his sins, still believed in that love. At least, until the truth revealed itself. Danielle had always been something of a mystery, even back in the early days when Marcus first laid eyes on her. She came into his life during a low point when he was out on bond and staring down the inevitability of trial. He remembered her walking into that dingy community center where his cousin was holding a card game, dressed in a plain blouse and long skirt. Nothing flashy, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence that pulled eyes toward her. She wasn't loud, she wasn't pushy, but when she smiled at him from across the room, Marcus felt seen in a way he hadn't in years. Their romance unfolded quickly, almost suspiciously so. Within weeks, Danielle was driving him to court dates, cooking meals at his mother's house, and talking about loyalty like it was religion. She seemed to understand the chaos of his life without judgment. And when the hammer finally dropped, when the jury came back guilty and Marcus was led away in chains, Danielle was the only one in the courtroom who stood and shouted that she loved him. The words rang out above the murmur of reporters, above the shuffle of deputies. That moment branded itself into Marcus's memory, proof that someone on the outside was still willing to fight for him. Over the years, her devotion never wavered. Letters arrived every week without fail, each one sealed with a faint kiss of lipstick. Phone calls were answered with warmth, her voice a lifeline when the noise of prison life threatened to drown him. And the visits, always the visits. She showed up month after month, sitting across from him in those plastic chairs, recounting stories of errands and neighbors, promising that time would pass, that he would come home one day. Yet beneath the devotion, there were shadows Marcus never wanted to look at too closely. Danielle kept her past locked away like a vault. She never spoke about family. No siblings, no parents, no childhood memories. When Marcus pressed, she'd laugh it off, saying the past didn't matter, that what they had now was enough. Sometimes he'd ask about her job, and she'd answer in vague phrases, "I do clerical work," or "I pick up shifts here and there." Nothing specific, nothing concrete. Friends who knew Marcus before prison raised eyebrows when they heard about her. One cousin even muttered on a phone call, "Don't you think it's strange she came out of nowhere right when you went down?" Marcus bristled at the suggestion. In his world, loyalty was rare, and Danielle's loyalty seemed absolute. Why question a gift? Still, the doubts lingered like a dull ache, surfacing late at night when the lights in the cell block went dark and all he had were his thoughts. Danielle's appearance added to the mystery. She was careful with her presentation, always the wig, always the heavy makeup, always clothing that left little room for scrutiny. In the visitation room, where other wives and girlfriends came in jeans and t-shirts, Danielle appeared polished, almost guarded. Marcus told himself she just wanted to look her best for him, to give him something beautiful in the middle of ugliness. But sometimes, when a makeup smudged under her eyes, or when the wig shifted slightly, Marcus caught glimpses of something harder beneath the surface. He ignored it. He had to. Prison was built on survival, and survival often meant clinging to illusions. Danielle was his. She was the proof he wasn't forgotten, the reason he could still imagine a life outside. Without her, he was just another man rotting behind bars with no one waiting. Even the officers seemed curious about her. Marcus once overheard a guard mutter, "That's the one who never misses a visit." Huh, with a note of suspicion. Marcus shot the man a glare sharp enough to cut steel, daring him to say more. Inmate Gossip spread like wildfire, and Danielle was a favorite subject. Some of the men teased Marcus, saying, "Your girl's too good to be true." He'd laugh it off, but the words stung, planting seeds he tried desperately not to water. Still, Danielle played the part of the devoted wife perfectly. She cried during tough hearings, held his hands during visits, and sent commissary money when she could. She made promises about the future, a little house, a car with leather seats, maybe even kids if the timing was right. Marcus clung to those promises, even when logic told him they were fairy tales. But behind her devotion, cracks had always been there. Her refusal to be photographed with family, the way she avoided medical topics or brushed off talk about children, the way her voice sometimes dropped lower when she was tired, or how she seemed uneasy in the women's restroom during longer visits. Marcus noticed these things, filed them away in some corner of his mind, but he never confronted them. To do so would mean risking the only stability he had left. Now, sitting across from her again in that sterile room, Marcus couldn't shake the sense that the shadows in her story were pressing closer than ever. Her hands trembled slightly when she picked up a cup of vending machine coffee, her eyes darting as if measuring every word before she spoke. Marcus leaned in, trying to read her face, trying to convince himself she was the same woman who had promised to stand by him no matter what. But somewhere deep inside, in the place where instinct lives, he felt it, the unsettling whisper that the woman across from him carried a secret so heavy it could crush them both. The air in the visitation room felt heavy that afternoon, as though the walls themselves sensed the storm brewing. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the cold metal table, trying to catch Danielle's eyes. She kept glancing down at her hands, fingers picking nervously at the edge of a styrofoam cup. He'd seen her anxious before, worried about bills, about lawyers, about the endless years ticking by. But this was different. This was fear. "Talk to me," Marcus said quietly. "What's going on? You ain't yourself today." Danielle forced a smile, the kind that didn't touch her eyes. "I'm fine, baby. Just tired. Long week." Marcus wasn't convinced. He watched her movements closely, the way a predator studies prey. In prison, reading people wasn't a skill, it was survival. And something in her was trembling, trying to hold itself together. He shifted in his chair, suspicion gnawing at him. Then it happened. A guard on the far side of the room barked at a visitor for breaking protocol, startling Danielle. She jumped, spilling coffee across the table. In the flurry of motion, her purse tipped over. A slim leather wallet slid out, snapping open as it hit the floor. Marcus bent to grab it before the guards got curious. But as he flipped it shut, his eyes caught something he wasn't meant to see. For a split second, he froze. The ID card inside wasn't for Danielle Carter, his wife of nearly a decade. It bore another name, Daniel Carter, and the photo wasn't doctored makeup or a wig. It was Danielle stripped bare of illusion, features sharper, jawline harder, the truth staring back at him from government-issued plastic. Marcus's chest tightened, heat rushing through his skull. He shoved the wallet back across the table, staring at her, waiting for her to deny it, to explain, to do anything that could. Untangle the knot twisting inside him. Danielle's lips parted, but no words came. She knew what he'd seen. "You better tell me that ain't real," Marcus hissed, voice low but shaking. Tears welled in her eyes. "Marcus, I was going to explain. I didn't know how." The words hit him like a hammer. He felt every muscle in his body coil, his hands trembling with rage. Memories reeled through his mind. The wig, the vague stories, the careful distance she always kept. All the puzzle pieces slammed into place, and the picture they formed was unbearable. "You lied to me," he whispered, voice breaking. "All these years you lied." Danielle reached for his hands, but he jerked away. "I loved you," she said desperately. "Everything I did was real. The feelings, the loyalty, I never faked that." Marcus's vision blurred red. In his world, betrayal was the deepest cut. He'd survived prison politics, gang threats, even the crushing silence of solitary. But this humiliation carved deeper than any blade. Around them, other families whispered, sensing the shift. One mother ushered her child closer, eyes flicking toward Marcus's twisted face. Danielle tried again. I thought if you knew, you'd leave me. I couldn't lose you. Not when you needed me most. Her confession landed like gasoline on fire. The man she thought she knew, the woman he thought he loved, it all felt like a cruel trick. His breathing turned ragged, chest heaving as if the air itself was poisoned. He reached under his jumpsuit, fingers curling around the handle of something he'd kept hidden for weeks. A sharpened piece of metal, wrapped tight with cloth. A shank. Marcus hadn't planned to use it here. It was insurance, protection against the predators in the yard. But now, the weapon felt inevitable, like it had always been meant for this moment. His knuckles whitened as he pulled it free, the blade glinting under the harsh fluorescent light. Gasps erupted around the room. Guards stiffened, their hands moving toward batons and radios. But Marcus was already on his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. His world had collapsed into a single point, her face pale and stricken across the table. You made a fool out of me, he roared, voice shaking the walls. You think I can live with that? Danielle scrambled back, knocking into the table behind her, pleading through tears. Marcus, please. I love you. It doesn't change anything. I'm still me. But he couldn't hear her anymore. Betrayal drowned out reason. Rage silenced every shred of love. He lunged across the table, blade raised. Chaos exploded. Families screamed, children cried, officers surged forward, but in that split second, nothing could stop him. Steel met flesh. The sound was sickening, the kind that sears itself into memory. Danielle's cry choked off as blood bloomed against her dress, the stain spreading fast. Marcus drove the blade again. Again, each thrust fueled by a decade of trust turned to ash. Guards swarmed, tackling him to the ground. The shank clattered across the floor, slick with blood. Marcus fought like a man possessed, screaming incoherent words, veins bulging, eyes wild. It took 4 men to pin him, cuffs biting into his wrists as he thrashed. Danielle lay slumped against the table, her breaths shallow, eyes wide with shock and terror. The room was pandemonium. Families rushed toward the exits, officers shouting commands, alarms blaring. Cameras caught everything, every angle, every drop of blood. Marcus's chest heaved against the floor, spit foaming at his lips. He turned his head toward Danielle, eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and devastation. You lied, he growled, voice raw. You lied to me. And then the guards dragged him away, leaving behind the wreckage of a love story that had just turned into a national nightmare. The sound of the first scream tore through the visitation hall like a gunshot. Plastic chairs screeched across the floor as families scrambled back, mothers pulling children into their arms, husbands leaping up to shield their wives. In a room designed for controlled connection, order dissolved in seconds. All anyone could see was Marcus Devlin, wild-eyed and snarling, driving a homemade blade into the chest of the woman who had been his wife. Blood spattered across the gray table, dripping down onto the linoleum tiles below. Danielle gasped, her body jerking with each thrust, hands raised in a feeble attempt to stop him. The cheap fabric of her dress darkened, spreading into a grotesque bloom of red. Her wig slipped from her head in the struggle, tumbling onto the floor like a discarded mask. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some visitors staring in shock at the raw truth beneath her carefully constructed appearance. Stop him! For God's sake, stop him, someone shouted. 2 correctional officers rushed forward, batons drawn, but Marcus fought like a man possessed. He knocked one officer sideways with sheer rage-fueled strength, his cuffed wrist still slick with Danielle's blood as he tried to wrench free. His voice was hoarse, animalistic, spitting curses that no one could fully understand. Children cried, their wails mixing with the shrill alarms that suddenly blared overhead, bathing the room in flashing red light. Danielle collapsed sideways, her chair tipping with her. She hit the floor hard, coughing blood, eyes wide and glassy. Her trembling fingers reached out, leaving streaks of crimson across the linoleum. For a moment she locked eyes with Marcus, an expression caught somewhere between sorrow, fear, and something that looked almost like love. Then her body sagged, consciousness slipping. The entire room smelled of copper, that unmistakable metallic tang of blood filling the air. Visitors gagged, covering their mouths. One little boy buried his face in his mother's shirt, sobbing as she tried to shield him from the horror. A man across the room banged his fists against the glass, screaming for help, though the guards were already surging in. 3 officers tackled Marcus at once, their combined weight driving him to the floor. He roared in fury, spitting as he thrashed, his voice echoing over the alarms. "She lied to me. You all saw it. She lied." His words were shredded by the chaos, lost in the cacophony of boots pounding, radios crackling, families begging to be released from the room. The shank skittered across the floor, clinking against the wall before being kicked aside by a guard. Its crude edges were still wet, crimson drops streaking across the polished concrete. A female officer pressed a gloved hand against Danielle's chest wound, shouting for medical backup, her voice tight with urgency. Blood pooled fast, seeping between her fingers despite the pressure. "Stay with me," the officer demanded, but Danielle's breaths were shallow, her lips already tinged with blue. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to fight under the pile of guards. His face was a mask of fury and grief, veins bulging at his temples. It took pepper spray, a baton to the ribs, and 5 men to finally restrain him, wrenching his arms behind his back and slamming shackles around his ankles. Even then, his chest heaved like a raging bull, eyes fixed on Danielle with a mixture of betrayal and madness. "Look at her," he shouted, voice breaking. "That's not who she said she was. She played me." No one answered. No one could. The visitors were herded toward the exits, many sobbing, some in shock, others furious at the guards for not acting sooner. A mother clutched her daughter and whispered, "Don't look back, baby, don't look back." One man cursed under his breath, vowing to sue the prison for allowing something like this to happen in front of his children. The scene had shifted from intimate family gathering to blood-soaked crime scene in less than a minute. Paramedics rushed in, their gurney rattling against the tiles. They lifted Danielle carefully, working quickly, voices sharp and professional. "Pulse weak," one called. "Massive blood loss. We need transport now." They strapped oxygen over her face, but her chest barely rose. The wig was gone, her face bare, the truth unhidden under harsh fluorescent lights. Cameras overhead captured everything. The blood, the chaos, the dying spouse whose identity was now the center of an unfolding nightmare. As they wheeled her toward the door, Marcus twisted his head to watch. His face streaked with sweat and spray, contorted in something raw, anguish, fury, disbelief. He shouted after her, "You should have told me. You should have told me the truth." His voice cracked, and for a heartbeat the rage gave way to something else, something almost childlike in its desperation. But the guards yanked him back, dragging him upright and shoving him toward the opposite door. His orange jumpsuit was stained with blood, his wrists cuffed tight, his eyes still blazing. Every camera caught the image, the killer being dragged one way, the victim's lifeless body carried the other. Outside the room, the prison went into full lockdown. Sirens wailed, gates clanged shut, and officers barked orders over radios. Visitors were funneled out under heavy supervision, each one pale, shaken, some of them already on their phones, telling the world what they'd seen. Within minutes, the story would leak, headlines screaming about a murder in the heart of a federal facility. Inside the visitation room, silence finally settled after the chaos. Blood still glistened on the floor, smeared across tables and walls. A lone chair sat overturned, a grotesque reminder of how quickly love and loyalty had turned to horror. Guards taped off the area, their boots echoing as they muttered to one another in disbelief. One younger officer whispered, "How the hell did he even get a blade in here?" Another shook his head, staring at the blood-slick floor. "Doesn't matter now. Whole country's gonna want answers." Back in the holding corridor, Marcus sat restrained, his chest still heaving, his mind a storm. He stared down at his shackled hands, trembling with adrenaline and fury, muttering under his breath. She lied. The cameras didn't stop rolling. The system had caught it all. The reveal, the rage, the violence. And before the night was over, the world outside those prison walls would know too. The visitation room had barely been cleared before investigators descended like a storm. Yellow tape stretched across the door, officers snapped photos of every blood droplet, and evidence markers lined the floor where Danielle's purse, wig, and the crude weapon had fallen. The prison, normally a fortress of order, felt rattled to its core. A homicide inside federal walls was bad enough. But a homicide during supervised visitation, on camera, in front of families, was the kind of scandal that made wardens' careers collapse overnight. The first question echoed through every corridor. How did Marcus Devlin get a weapon past 3 layers of security? Visitation protocols were supposed to be airtight. Inmates were searched before leaving their cells, again before entering the visiting hall, and often scanned by a metal detector. Yet Marcus had walked into that room with a shank wrapped in cloth, sharp enough to puncture an artery. Detective Carla Hughes, called in from the Federal Investigative Unit, crouched near the blade now sealed in an evidence bag. It was crude, fashioned from a piece of metal that looked like it had been snapped off a ventilation grate or salvaged from the machine shop. The handle was wrapped with strips of cloth from a prison-issued towel. She'd seen weapons like it before, but what struck her was where it had been used. In the yard. I could believe it, she muttered to the crime scene tech. But in a visitation room? That means he smuggled it in here. Smuggled it past the guards, past the checks, past the cameras. The warden, a barrel-chested man named Thomas Clay, stood outside the room, giving clipped orders to his staff. Sweat glistened at his temples despite the air conditioning. He knew the press would be calling before dawn, and he needed answers. Check every camera feed, he barked. I want to know what Marcus had on him when he left his cell. Pull the logs. Who searched him? Who signed off? In the surveillance booth, officers scrubbed through footage frame by frame. On camera, Marcus looked calm during the pat-down, lifting his arms as the guard ran hands along his jumpsuit. Nothing seemed amiss. But when Hughes reviewed the clip again, she noticed something subtle. A quick hesitation, the guard tapping Marcus's waistband only lightly before moving on. Was it negligence? Or something worse? Whispers of corruption spread almost immediately. Inmates had long complained that contraband flowed through the prison like water, phones, drugs, even alcohol, always finding their way inside despite the supposed lockdown environment. The unspoken truth was that someone on staff had to be looking the other way, sometimes for money, sometimes for favors. And now, with blood still drying on the visitation room floor, suspicion settled squarely on the officers. Meanwhile, Danielle's body lay in the county morgue, her identity under a microscope. Coroners confirmed what Marcus had raged about, that she had been living under a carefully constructed secret. Her legal documents were inconsistent, some under the name Danielle Carter, others tracing back to a birth certificate for Daniel Carter. Investigators knew this revelation would ignite a firestorm once it leaked to the press. But the more urgent problem for the prison was the weapon. Reporters had already gotten wind of the killing. By nightfall, local TV anchors were broadcasting outside the prison gates. The words "Murder Inside Federal Visitation Room" scrolled across screens, accompanied by shaky cell phone clips from frantic visitors who had recorded the aftermath. One video showed guards wrestling Marcus to the floor, another captured blood smeared across the table, Danielle's wig abandoned nearby. Within hours, the clips hit social media, drawing millions of views and sparking outrage. How could this happen in a federal facility? One anchor demanded during a live broadcast. Families should feel safe visiting their loved ones. Tonight, they're traumatized. Parents of children who had been in the room gave interviews, describing their kids' nightmares, their screams, their terror. Lawsuits were already being discussed. Back inside, investigators built a timeline. They reconstructed Marcus's movements. Breakfast in the Chow Hall at 7 a.m., returned to his cell block, pat down at 11:15, then escorted with 10 other inmates to the visitation wing. Somewhere along that path, He had either concealed the weapon or received it. But from whom? Hughes pressed the search officer who had cleared Marcus that morning. The man was pale, his hands trembling as he swore he'd done the pat-down properly. He didn't have anything, I swear. I checked, but Hughes had seen the footage, the hesitation, the too quick pass. Either the guard missed it, or he was complicit. The FBI joined the investigation by dawn, adding weight to the storm. They seized staff schedules, searched lockers, even brought dogs to sweep the facility for hidden caches of metal. Every officer was interrogated. Every inmate Marcus had spoken to in the weeks before the killing was isolated and questioned. The warden issued a statement calling it an unprecedented breach of safety, but privately, he knew the damage was already done. National networks picked up the story within 24 hours. By then, the details were impossible to contain. The husband, the hidden identity of the wife, the stabbing in full view of children. Headlines screamed betrayal, security lapses, and scandal. Talk shows debated everything from prison reform to gender identity, and politicians were already demanding hearings. As for Marcus, he sat in solitary confinement, shackled and silent. Guards who brought him food trays said he muttered the same words over and over under his breath. She lied. She lied. And in the echoing corridors of the prison, one question lingered louder than the rest. Was this just a crime of passion, or the symptom of a system so broken that even its walls couldn't contain the violence inside? At the county morgue, the hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound as technicians wheeled Danielle's body into the examination room. The blood had been washed away, the wig bagged as evidence, and the makeup smeared by sweat and chaos. On the cold steel table, stripped of the careful presentation she'd built over years, the truth of Danielle Carter could no longer be hidden. Dr. Elaine Shun, the medical examiner assigned to the case, began her work with meticulous precision. The autopsy confirmed what the prison chaos had already hinted. Danielle had been born male. Her body carried the physical markers of someone who had undergone partial transition, hormonal therapy, some cosmetic surgeries, but no full reassignment. Her chest bore faint surgical scars, carefully hidden under clothing all these years. Blood tests later confirmed high levels of estrogen, consistent with long-term treatment. The report was clinical, detached. But outside those walls, the findings carried the weight of dynamite. Detectives knew that once this information reached the public, the narrative would shift instantly. No longer was it only the story of a husband murdering his wife inside a federal prison. It would become a debate about identity, deception, love, and betrayal. Detective Carla Hughes sifted through Danielle's belongings. The wallet, recovered from the visitation room, held 2 IDs, one issued under the name Danielle Carter, complete with a female gender marker, and an older card in the name of Daniel Carter, male, from another state. There were no clear family connections listed, no emergency contacts. It was as if Danielle had carefully built a life meant to withstand scrutiny, except under the kind of scrutiny that followed a violent death. When Hughes pulled financial records, the picture grew more complicated. Danielle had worked under the table for years, cleaning jobs, clerical gigs, part-time shifts under aliases. Bank accounts were slim, savings almost non-existent. Yet she had poured thousands into prison commissary and phone calls, funding Marcus's small comforts behind bars. Every cent seemed to go toward maintaining her role as the loyal wife. Interviews with neighbors painted an image of a woman who kept to herself. She lived in a modest apartment, rarely socialized, and when she did, her stories about her past were vague. One neighbor recalled asking about her family, only for Danielle to laugh and say, "They're gone, all gone. It's just me now." Another remembered her mentioning a brother once, but the details were inconsistent. The detectives pressed deeper. Birth records in her home state confirmed the truth. Daniel Carter, born in 1983, assigned male at birth. No record of legal name change in that jurisdiction. Somehow, Danielle had acquired identification under her chosen name in another state, slipping through bureaucratic cracks. The motive for secrecy was clear enough. For years, Danielle had feared rejection, not just from society, but from Marcus himself. To tell him the truth would have been to risk losing the only connection that gave her life meaning. So she kept the secret buried, hoping her devotion would be enough to shield it. But now that devotion was twisted into the heart of a murder investigation. By the third day, the press had the leak. A local paper ran the headline first. Victim in federal prison killing was transgender woman. Within hours, national outlets followed, each spinning the story in their own way. Talk shows framed it as a tale of deception. LGBTQ+ advocates decried the coverage as cruel and sensationalist, pointing out that Danielle had lived authentically, even if she hadn't shared her full history. Social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Danielle and hashtag Prison Wife Secret trended side by side, battling for dominance. Some users sympathized with her, arguing she had given Marcus loyalty in a place where loyalty was scarce. Others defended Marcus, claiming any man would snap after such a revelation. The case had shifted from a simple murder investigation to a national conversation about identity, trust, and violence. Meanwhile, Hughes and her team traced Danielle's life backward. Old acquaintances described Danielle Carter as quiet, artistic, sometimes bullied in school. In her early 20s, she disappeared from her hometown, resurfacing years later in another state as Danielle. No one seemed to know what happened in between, how she had managed the transformation, or what sacrifices it had taken. One clue came from medical records tucked in a storage box in her apartment. Prescriptions for estrogen and spironolactone filled under both names over the years. It suggested a long, determined process of transition, undertaken quietly, without support. Hughes studied the documents, feeling a strange pang of sorrow. Whatever else could be said, Danielle had fought to build a life on her own terms. And then she had tethered that life to a man locked behind bars. Why? That question haunted the detectives. The answer came from her diary, discovered in a dresser drawer. Pages of flowing script revealed a woman desperate for love and terrified of abandonment. She wrote about Marcus like he was her anchor in the storm, the only man who had ever made her feel safe. He sees me as his wife, his partner, his one constant, one entry read. I can't risk losing that. If he knew the truth, he would hate me, and I couldn't bear it. Those words, now evidence, painted a tragic picture. A woman who gave everything she had to sustain a love built on silence, only to lose her life when that silence shattered. By the end of the week, the FBI's official report confirmed what the autopsy and documents had already made clear. Danielle Carter was transgender, living under an identity she had carefully maintained for years. The revelation didn't change the brutality of her death, but it reshaped the narrative and set the stage for a trial that would not only weigh Marcus's guilt, but also drag the most intimate questions of gender and trust into the harshest spotlight imaginable. And in his solitary cell, Marcus paced like a caged animal. By the time the weekend rolled around, the killing at the federal prison had jumped from local scandal to national obsession. Cable news networks ran the footage on a loop, grainy security clips of Marcus Devlin lunging across the visitation table, guards piling on top of him, visitors screaming in the background. Anchors spoke in somber tones, their cheer-ins blaring with phrases like murder in the visitation room and transgender wife's secret exposed. The story had every ingredient the media machine thrived on. Violence, betrayal, identity, and the spectacle of it all happening inside one of the most secure facilities in the country. Morning talk shows leaned into the shock value. One host opened her segment by asking, "Is deception in marriage ever grounds for violence?" Of course not. But what do we make of this? Her panel erupted into debate, with one commentator arguing that Marcus's reaction was monstrous and inexcusable, while another suggested that the revelation would have been devastating to any man in his position. Ratings soared as the hosts fanned the flames. On social media, the conversation was even louder. Twitter became a battleground of hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Danielle trended alongside hashtag He Was Lied To, each side hurling arguments in 280 characters. Some users shared heartfelt tributes, pointing out Danielle's devotion. 10 years of visits, thousands of dollars sent to commissary, endless letters of support. She gave him everything, one tweet read, and he killed her for being honest too late. Others blasted her secrecy, calling it manipulation, even betrayal. Memes circulated, some cruel, some satirical, some genuinely mourning. LGBTQ plus advocates held press conferences condemning not only the murder, but also the media's framing. Danielle Carter was a woman. One spokesperson declared firmly, "She lived as a woman, she loved as a woman, and she was murdered for it." This is not about deception. It's about the deadly consequences of transphobia. Their words drew applause from supporters, but ignited furious backlash from critics who accused them of ignoring the lie. Cable pundits shifted the focus toward the prison system itself. How could an inmate smuggle a weapon into a visitation room? Parents of children who had witnessed the attack gave emotional interviews, describing their kids' nightmares, their fear of ever visiting again. Lawsuits loomed as families demanded accountability. In living rooms across America, people debated whether the real story was Marcus's rage or the system's failure to keep everyone safe. Even late-night comedians took their shots. One joked, "You know your prison's in trouble when the most dangerous part isn't the yard, it's the family room." The audience laughed, but the punchline underscored a darker truth. The murder had turned a supposedly secure environment into a stage for one of the most shocking crimes of the year. Talk radio callers, meanwhile, poured gasoline on the fire. Some called Marcus a monster, a violent man who deserved to die in prison. Others painted him as a victim of humiliation, betrayed by someone who hid their true identity. The lines blurred between crime story and culture war, and Marcus's name became shorthand for every fear, prejudice, and unresolved debate about gender in America. For the prison administration, the media frenzy was a nightmare. Reporters camped outside the gates, shoving microphones in the faces of staff as they came and went. Every new leak about the shank, about the pat-down, about Danielle's dual IDs, kept the scandal alive. Politicians seized the moment, demanding hearings on federal prison safety and vowing to get to the bottom of this grotesque failure. Inside solitary, Marcus caught glimpses of the storm through snippets on the prison television. Guards reported hearing him laugh bitterly when a newscaster described Danielle as a transgender wife. He muttered to himself, "Now they're all talking about it. Now they know I wasn't crazy." For him, the coverage felt like validation, even as the world outside recoiled in horror. By the end of the week, the murder wasn't just a crime story. It was a national referendum on trust, identity, and violence. Communities held vigils for Danielle, candles flickering under banners that read, "Love shouldn't kill." Meanwhile, others quietly whispered that Marcus, however brutal, had only done what many men might have in the same situation. It was the collision of two Americas, broadcast live, with Danielle's blood still fresh on the linoleum floors of a visitation room. And as the trial loomed on the horizon, it was clear this case would not be judged only in a courtroom. It would be judged in living rooms, on Twitter feeds, in church pews, and on the floor of Congress. The trial of State versus Marcus Devlin opened to a courtroom packed so full that security had to turn people away at the doors. Reporters lined the front benches, their notepads ready, cameras waiting outside for every recess. Spectators craned their necks to see the man at the center of it all, the inmate who had turned a visitation room into a blood-soaked stage. Marcus Devlin shuffled in wearing a press suit provided by his public defender, but the heavy shackles around his ankles clinked with every step, reminding everyone he was still very much a prisoner. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as a violent man who had been waiting for the chance to explode. Assistant District Attorney Carlin Gwynn opened with chilling words, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this was not a moment of passion. This was premeditated murder, committed in the most sacred of spaces, a visitation room, where children should have been safe. Marcus Devlin smuggled a weapon into that room. He made a choice to kill." She gestured to the screens where grainy video played. Marcus leaping forward, Danielle collapsing in a blur of blood and chaos. Jurors shifted uncomfortably at the replay, the screams from that day echoing once more through the chamber. Defense attorney Samuel Breyer countered with an entirely different narrative. His voice was calm, almost pleading. My client is guilty of being human. He was deceived in the most intimate way possible, discovering in front of dozens of strangers that the woman he thought he married had hidden a life-altering truth from him. Did he react violently? Yes. But was it calculated murder? No. It was shock. It was betrayal. It was a man pushed beyond his breaking point. Breyer leaned heavily on the idea of temporary insanity, a sudden psychological snap that no amount of prison security could have prevented. Witness after witness took the stand. The guards who had wrestled Marcus to the ground recounted how he screamed, "She lied to me," over and over. Their testimony underscored the rage, but also the disorientation, the sense that Marcus was lost in a red haze rather than executing a plan. A mother who had been in the room with her daughter testified through tears, describing the trauma her child still carried from watching Danielle bleed out on the floor. Her voice broke as she said, "How do I tell my little girl she was safe when she saw something like that?" The jury also heard from the forensic pathologist, Dr. Elaine Shun, who clinically detailed Danielle's injuries and confirmed the weapon was a prison-made shank capable of piercing deep into tissue. When asked directly if Danielle could have survived had Marcus stopped after the first strike, Shun nodded grimly. Yes. The fatal wound was the third stab to the chest cavity. The earlier injuries were serious, but not instantly fatal. That detail weighed heavily, suggesting persistence rather than a single uncontrollable outburst. But the defense struck back with Danielle's diary, entered into evidence after lengthy arguments. Breyer read passages aloud. Danielle, writing about her fear of losing Marcus if he ever discovered her past, her desperate efforts to maintain their marriage through secrecy. The courtroom fell silent as her own words were heard. He is my anchor. I can't risk losing him. If he knew the truth, he would hate me, and I could not survive that. Breyer turned to the jury and asked, does that sound like a woman trying to harm him, or someone clinging to love, terrified of rejection? The clash of narratives spilled into every corner of the trial. Prosecutors hammered the point that Marcus had brought a weapon into the visitation room, a weapon he had no business possessing unless he had violence in mind. The defense pushed back, arguing that every inmate carried protection in one form or another, a grim reality of prison life. That blade wasn't meant for her, Breyer insisted. It was meant for survival in the yard. What happened in that room was tragic, but it was not planned. Expert testimony deepened the complexity. A psychologist explained how discovering a partner's hidden identity in a public, humiliating setting could trigger a dissociative rage episode. The human brain, under extreme stress, can enter a fight-or-flight state where rational judgment collapses, she said. The prosecution countered with their own expert, who testified that Marcus's repeated stabbing showed control, not dissociation. He made choices in those moments. He chose to continue. The trial became more than a legal battle. It became theater. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily. On one side, LGBTQ+ advocates held signs reading, "Love her, don't kill her," and chanted Danielle's name. On the other, supporters of Marcus argued he was set up to snap, holding banners with slogans like "Truth Matters" and "Deception Destroys Lives." Police had to separate the crowds more than once when tempers boiled over. Inside, the jury sat stone-faced, caught between two irreconcilable truths: a brutal murder caught on camera, and a betrayal that seemed to explain, though not excuse, the violence. Each day brought new details, new angles, and the relentless pressure of a nation watching. Closing arguments drove the tension to its peak. Adiane Nguyen's voice thundered through the courtroom. If we allow this act to be excused by lies, we are saying murder is acceptable when someone feels hurt. That is not justice. That is chaos. She pointed to the victim's bloody dress displayed in evidence, a haunting reminder of the violence. Breyer, in turn, leaned closer to the jury, his tone almost whispering. Marcus Devlin is not innocent, but he is not the monster the state wants you to believe. He was a man shattered in an instant, blinded by shock, betrayed at the deepest level. Justice must have mercy. Do not confuse pain with premeditation. When the gavel finally fell that day, the jury was left with a question far larger than the man sitting at the defense table. Were they judging Marcus Devlin only for the blood spilled in that visitation room? Or were they also passing judgment on the secrets, the lies, and the impossible collision of love and truth that had brought him there? The room emptied into hushed corridors, but outside, the chants of protesters thundered louder than ever. The world was waiting for a verdict, and no matter what the jury decided, half the country was bound to erupt. The jury deliberated for 2 full days, sequestered in a quiet hotel where the noise of the outside world couldn't reach them. Reporters camped on the courthouse steps, broadcasting updates every hour, speculating about which way the 12 men and women would lean. The evidence was clear. Marcus Devlin had killed Danielle in a room full of witnesses, every strike caught on camera. But intent, premeditation versus a sudden storm of rage, was the question that kept them locked behind closed doors. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, the tension was so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Marcus sat at the defense table, suit rumpled, eyes hollow. He didn't look at the crowd or even his lawyer. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his lips moving faintly in that same mantra the guards had heard in solitary. She lied. She lied. All rise. The bailiff commanded as Judge Ronald Hayes took his seat. The courtroom stood, then sat again in unison. The clerk read the verdicts one by one. On the charge of first-degree murder, not guilty. On the charge of second-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of possessing a deadly weapon inside a federal facility, guilty. A ripple spread through the gallery. Gasps, murmurs, even a few shouted curses. Some LGBTQ+ advocates shook their heads in disbelief, feeling the verdict fell short of true justice. Others, including Marcus's few supporters, exhaled as though he had been spared from the harshest fate. Judge Hayes's voice cut through the noise. Mr. Devlin, the jury has spoken. You are guilty of second-degree murder and of unlawfully possessing a weapon. For these crimes, this court sentences you to an additional 40 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively with your current sentence. Effectively, sir, you will never leave prison alive. The words landed like stones in the room. Marcus blinked slowly, as if it took him a moment to register. Then he gave a hollow laugh, quiet, bitter. He looked at the ceiling, muttering something inaudible before marshals shackled him and led him toward the side door. In the gallery, Danielle's supporters wept openly. A small group of her friends from the LGBTQ+ community held one another, whispering prayers. One woman clutched a candle she had carried to nightly vigils, her tears streaking silently. For them, the verdict was a reminder that while Marcus had been punished, the woman they loved was still gone, and her truth had been weaponized against her in death. Outside, the courthouse plaza erupted. Protesters from both sides shouted at each other across barricades. Some called the sentence too light, others too harsh. News anchors captured the raw division, their voices barely audible over chants of justice for Danielle and truth betrayed. Judge Hayes ended the session with a stern reflection. This case has drawn national attention not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the deeply human themes of identity and trust. Let this court remind the public, deception does not excuse violence, and violence does not erase truth. We all live with secrets, but no secret should cost a life. As the gavel came down, the trial was over, but the story had already outgrown the courtroom. For Marcus, the rest of his life would be spent behind bars, his name synonymous with rage and betrayal. For Danielle, memorials continued across the country, her story igniting conversations about love, gender, and the peril of silence. And for the nation, the case left scars that would not fade easily, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones kept closest to the heart. In the months after the verdict, the story of Marcus Devlin and Danielle Carter refused to fade. Documentaries picked apart every frame of surveillance footage, Podcasts dissected the timeline, and talk shows invited panels of lawyers, psychologists, and activists to argue over what it all meant. It was no longer just about a stabbing in a prison visitation room. It had become a cultural flashpoint, a case study in the collision of secrecy, identity, and rage. For the prison system, the fallout was immediate. Federal reviews exposed glaring lapses in security, from negligent pat-downs to smuggling networks that had allowed Marcus to carry a blade into the visitation room. Several officers were quietly dismissed, and the warden, Thomas Clay, announced his resignation under pressure. New protocols were rolled out nationwide: stricter searches, more cameras, and tighter supervision during visits. But for many, it was too late. Parents who had been present that day said their children still woke screaming from nightmares, and lawsuits against the Bureau of Prisons piled high. Danielle's story, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. Vigils spread beyond her home state. Candles lit in cities from Los Angeles to New York. LGBTQ+ advocates held her name up as a symbol of the dangers transgender women face, especially when their identities become points of violence. Murals appeared on walls in urban neighborhoods. Danielle's face painted with angel wings, the words "Live Your Truth" scrawled beside her. But not everyone agreed on how to remember her. In some corners of the internet, her secrecy was weaponized against her, and her death became fodder for cruel debates about trust in relationships. The divide that marked her life carried into her legacy. Inside prison walls, Marcus became a figure both feared and pitied. Some inmates saw him as a man who had snapped under humiliation, while others whispered that he'd crossed a line even hardened convicts couldn't justify. Guards said his eyes carried a haunted look, as if replaying the moment again and again, trapped in the loop of betrayal and blood. For the broader public, the case became a mirror. Churches held sermons about sin and forgiveness. Universities taught it in sociology courses, and true crime programs milked the details for ratings. Danielle's diary excerpts, read aloud in court, were replayed on screens nationwide. Her handwriting transformed into evidence. Her longing for love turned into a cautionary tale. Judge Hayes's words at sentencing echoed long after the gavel fell. Deception does not excuse violence, and violence does not erase truth. Those words were etched into editorials and quoted in protests, a simple summation of a tragedy that defied simplicity. In the end, 2 lives have been destroyed, one buried under stone, the other entombed in concrete walls. Around them, families, communities, and institutions bore the aftershocks. The prison system tightened its grip. The media moved on to the next scandal. But in quiet corners, Danielle's friends still lit candles, whispering her name, while Marcus lived out his days behind bars, shackled not only by steel, but by the weight of a secret that had detonated in the harshest light possible. The case faded from headlines, but lingered in memory, a grim reminder that the truths we hide and the ways they are revealed can carry consequences as fatal as any weapon.